The word holy is basically a biblical word, but it's one of these biblical words which is well understood by everyone and can be pressed into service in a wide variety of ordinary contexts. A good undertaking may be described as a holy cause. An awesome thing might be called the holy grail of its kind, and holy guacamole is commonly used to express surprise, along with a few other variations. Regardless of the example, when we use the word in English, we typically mean something like exceedingly good or pure, free from any evil. It may surprise you to learn, however, that it is very common for Christian pastors to teach that actually that is not what holy means. That holy actually means set apart, so that something that is holy is different from the things of the world, that it is consecrated or dedicated. So this idea has been rattling around in my head for a few years without thinking much of it, but it's kind of a big deal. Holy is a common word in the Bible, and it is featured in very important passages. God himself is described as holy, and what should that mean to us? On top of that, I know a lot of Christians are aware of this set apart definition, but it doesn't seem like anyone has transitioned to thinking about it in that way consistently. Why is that? Maybe the word holy, meaning good and pure, is deeply ingrained in us for a good reason. And you know pastors are always looking for some fresh new insight for their congregations. Maybe this is just a fad that people are repeating without justification. I've resolved to look into this and relay my findings, whatever they may be. According to my count, there are 1,034 instances in the Bible where a word translated as holy is used. And I looked at them all so you don't have to. I want to address this question by looking at all the examples and sharing some of the most interesting ones with you. Can we consistently translate the word used for holy into one of these two possibilities? Will clues from the context show us which option should be preferred in all cases? This is the Hebrew word which we translate as holy, written in the modern Hebrew script, Kadosh. And remember that Hebrew is written from right to left. One of the first things I noticed when I was looking through the uses of Kadosh in the Old Testament is how many of them referred to objects. Utensils, vessels, garments, crowns, fields, oil, bread, censers, the altar, even water. Yes, that's right, holy water. This is a lot of things, and they don't seem to have much in common. It isn't like they're all made of the same material or something. And they all may be very nice and sensible objects, but there is no sense in which they are moral. They've never robbed a bank or helped a lady across the street. They themselves are morally neutral or inert, but God describes them as being made holy. This is our first hint that our common definition of holy may be lacking. Another common feature of the Old Testament was that many times things and people are described as being holy to God. What does this mean if holy is about moral perfection? Someone might say that this means that the thing or person is morally perfect in God's sight, but this interpretation is not permitted by the contexts. For example, consider these verses, and there are many, many more verses like these, and they confirm the trend. It really is possible to be holy to God. Holiness can be a relational property. When the Old Testament talks about people being holy, we are usually talking about priests, prophets, Nazarites, or others who are dedicated to God, not just a righteous person. This is usually translated as consecrated, but even consecrated is kind of an unclear word. Something consecrated is somehow good, But in which sense of the word? Priests are described as being anointed and consecrated, literally kadosh. Now, anointed is something we have a pretty good idea about. Literally, it means smeared because an anointed person would be smeared, anointed, with oil. And this signifies them being officially assigned to their task. In modern terms, this is a kind of swearing in ceremony, and the anointed one becomes God's representative on earth in that area, whether it is the king or priest or otherwise. This has even greater significance because the Hebrew word anointed is Mashiach, Messiah, and so Jesus is the anointed one. But that is a whole other discussion. A person being holy or consecrated does carry a similar flavor. They are consecrated to God to enable them to perform their task. And other English words like dedicated and devoted do a good job of capturing the meaning of holy here. The priests performing the temple rituals are dedicated to God, holy to fulfilling their assigned purpose. And to take it one step further, sometimes kadosh means something like select or assign. And this does not need to be in a religious sense at all. We see verses where it talks about selecting a region of land for a purpose, or selecting guests for a meal. And, most extreme of all, the word holy is even used to assign or call an assembly for the evil Canaanite god Baal, or, as we more commonly pronounce it, Baal. With all of that said, I think it is quite clear that there is something to the idea that holy should not always be translated as morally pure. Words we might use for kadosh are devoted, dedicated, consecrated, sanctified, sacred, assigned, select, and appoint. Some of these terms, like consecrated, sanctified, and sacred, carry the uncertainty of the original, but most of them are clear. The words are similar, although there are contexts where use of one would clearly be unjustified, while another would be appropriate. For example, in English we would never say, "I have selected my life to helping autistic children," or "I dedicated a contractor for the work on the garage." But in ancient Hebrew, it would be totally fine to use the same word for both. And that is no surprise. Ancient Hebrew is a language with many fewer words than modern English. So, as a result, individual words are doing more work, with more definitions and more senses of the word. And I think this is why preachers talk about holy as meaning set apart. Set apart is a broad mental picture which encompasses all of these little ideas. So, holy does mean set apart. But some questions do remain. Okay, we understand what it means for us to be holy, set apart to God. But what does it mean for God to be holy? What is He set apart to? More on this later. The New Testament was written in Greek rather than Hebrew, so this can add another layer of complexity. The Greek word translated as holy is hagios. Hagios, and variations of it, appear in the New Testament 277 times. Now, when I say that this is a complicating factor, what I mean is that each language is different, especially in the ancient world. The Greek concept of holy may have been very different than the Hebrew concept of holy. So this can result in translation issues. With that said, it seems that the New Testament writers consistently translate kadosh as hagios, and I did not notice any cause for concern. But maybe I'm missing something. Who knows? A large number of the times when the word hagios is used in the New Testament is when referring to the Holy Spirit. This doesn't help us address the current question, but suffice it to say, the New Testament talks about the Holy Spirit a lot. Now, I hate to break it to you, but the story doesn't end there. I know. Sometimes it can be just too much to take. I know this may be hard for some, but the New Testament uses the word hagios almost exclusively in the way English speakers usually think of the word holy, morally pure. The first indication of this is many verses which include holy along with words indicating moral purity. We see phrases like holy and righteous, holy and blameless, holy and godly. And this is a common rhetorical device. Repeating similar words can give a concept of additional emphasis. It also fits with the Bible's inherent tendency towards repetition. I don't know if you're aware of this, but the writing in the Bible will often say something in one sentence and then repeat it in another way in the following sentence. This is called Hebrew parallelism. To our modern way of thinking, this is repetitive, and we typically don't write like that. Hey, I already said it once. If the reader didn't pay attention, that's on them. But this method serves to solidify it in the reader's mind. Furthermore, as luck would have it, this is critical to our interpretation thousands of years later. So many times I've seen a line where the meaning was uncertain because of the phrasing or something, but then, wouldn't you know it, the next line is a rephrasing which completely clarifies the intent. What a blessing it is, almost like it was intentional. Now, at this point, someone might say, this is not definitive proof. Different words are used together all the time. Although that is true, these are still very good examples, but regardless, I agree that it is not conclusive evidence. So let's move on. Stronger still are the verses which contrast opposites. Here we see holiness being contrasted with impurity, wickedness, and vileness. And unlike the previous example, where it was unclear if the words were synonyms, the structure of the sentences makes it abundantly clear that these are to be seen as opposites. So, holiness, in these contexts, must be the opposite of impurity, wickedness, and vileness. Something like purity. And if that weren't enough, there are some more verses which spell out holy as being without blemish and free from accusation, and which say, to purify ourselves of every evil is to perfect holiness. So I think that the evidence is just too strong, and anyone who wants to say that holy always and only means set apart is not right either. At this point, or perhaps earlier while I was laying this out, a doubt may creep in. All of the set apart verses are from the Old Testament, but all of the purity verses you quoted are from the New Testament. Did the meaning change? Maybe the meaning evolved over time. Or maybe the Greek word hagios has a slightly different flavor than kadosh, and this has impacted the New Testament writers. Or maybe Paul redefined holy, or, less charitably, Paul corrupted the New Testament. Or maybe you are from the rabbinic perspective, or otherwise think the New Testament is no good. So maybe the Christians misunderstood or twisted the Hebrew Bible. These are all very real considerations with varying levels of reasonableness. Certainly, languages do change over time, and the Bible is not immune to this. It was written over more than 1,000 years, and the lettering script used to write the language changed 3 times over that period. With that said, it does seem like language changed less rapidly than it does for us in our modern context. And I've never seen an example of a word in the Bible changing meaning. But it certainly could happen, and language differences always should be considered. And, to be fair, Paul is often creative with the original meanings of passages. But, in defense of Paul, holy is used in this way in the Gospels, in the book of Acts, in 1 Peter, in the book of Revelation, and probably others, all of which had different authors, so at the very least, they all got it mixed up. And remember that Paul was trained as an expert rabbi with serious credentials. With that said, it is clear that they were not unaware of the concept of being set apart, because we see various New Testament authors using the word holy in precisely this way in a number of verses. While this is the minority case, the context of these verses make it very clear that they are not talking about moral perfection. The situation in the Old Testament was much less clear. As I mentioned before, according to my count, there are 1,034 places where the Bible used a variant of Kadosh or Hagios. But in many of these verses, it is not clear whether the word is meant in the set apart sense or morally perfect sense. I've done my best to choose examples where it is very clear which sense is intended. But in my search of the Old Testament, all of the clear examples were in the set apart sense, and I showed you many of those in previous slides. But finding examples of the morally perfect sense was much more difficult. These were the best I could find. I think some of these are pretty intriguing, but I have to admit that these are definitely debatable. So if someone wanted to argue with you that the Old Testament had no concept of holy meaning pure, you would have your work cut out for you. At least, it would not be as simple as pointing to a verse. I hope this video gave you an idea of how the word holy is used throughout the Bible and what it means for something or someone to be set apart to God. In the next video, I will explain how set apart and morally pure may actually be related concepts. Then, we will review some of the implications of this and how we should think of the word holy going forward.